3 years ago in Detroit, Detective Marty Kingston had been deep undercover when he was involved in a narcotics deal that went bad. In the ensuing gunfight, he had been shot in the leg. Now, as Marty entertained several school children, including his son, while dressed as the police mascot, his partner Sal Quintana is tracked at a club later, only for a hooded assassin to shoot at him. After a chase through the streets turns into a crash, Sal is eventually taken down. At his funeral the next week, Marty assures Sergeant Clark from Internal Affairs about doing everything to find his partner's culprit. Later, after speaking with fellow detectives Tyrone Fowler and Jimmy Rogan, the group decides to stay alert in the face of impending danger. Since Marty was Sal's partner for 8 years in the narcotics department, Lieutenant Walker assigns him Sal's case the next day along with an initially reluctant Detective Dan Sullivan. Their investigation leads them to the bar frequented by Sal, where they learn about his crooked ways. When they are told about Sal extorting money from the bar as well as another club, Dan and Marty head there to speak to its owner. Getting mistaken for taking over Sal's extortion duties, the owner then tells them about another guy who used to accompany Sal. When asked to describe the guy, all he says is that he is a big, scary-looking fellow with a scar over his eye. Another day, Marty turns up at Dan's place unexpectedly with his wife Beth and their son Casey. Having overheard earlier that Dan and his wife Layla would soon be parents, Marty thought of giving them the crib that Casey has now overgrown. Pleasantly surprised at the sweet gesture, Layla invites them over for dinner. Conversation flows freely among the group except for one topic about Marty and Beth's stay in Mexico earlier. A while later, Marty grabs his chance to speak to Dan on his own. Bonding over a drink, Marty learns that Dan was only 9 years old when he lost his father, who was also a cop. Inspired to be a cop because of this, Dan strives to solve every case he is given just so another widow and young kid do not share the same fate as his mother and him of not knowing the truth behind their grief. Investigating on his own the next day, Dan comes across a stash of cash in Sal's apartment. When the landlord barges in just then, Dan is told that Sal's partner, a big black and scary-looking guy, had given her a check last month for rent which wasn't honored. Seeing the said check, Dan learns that Sal's partner is indeed Tyrone Fowler and finds that his police records are classified. Intrigued, he then heads over to meet Tyrone and Jimmy. However, Tyrone seems to deliberately give vague answers and vehemently denies ever going to the club with Sal. Insulted over a newbie like Dan questioning his reputation, Tyrone then ominously threatens him to steer clear of him. Sergeant Clark of Internal Affairs finds Dan a while later and tells him that he has been looking into Sal for a couple of months already, and also that he recently even found a lead on Tyrone and Jimmy. Agreeing to help each other with any information they find further, Dan takes his leave. Elsewhere, Tyrone threatens Marty to get Dan off his back. Marty then tries to convince Dan to investigate in another direction and keep Tyrone out of it, but to no avail. Backed by his conversation with Sergeant Clark instead, Dan informs Marty about Sal, Tyrone, and Jimmy being under investigation by the Internal Affairs Department. He also tells him about Clark meeting Tyrone and Jimmy the next day. Later that evening, the assassin follows Tyrone to a massage center and shoots him as he tries to flee. At the docks later, the assassin approaches Jimmy's yacht in an attempt to end his life as well. Jimmy's preparedness, however, lets him counterattack initially before he is strangled with a rope. The struggle reveals Marty as the assassin, and just as he pushes the anchor off, Jimmy loses his life. Investigating the crime scene the next morning, Dan gets a hold of the security footage, preparing to take Dan out in case the truth is revealed. Marty is immensely relieved, however, to learn that the bad quality of the recording has ensured that his face isn't clearly seen. Deducing that Jimmy planned to escape before having to face Clark's investigation, Dan correctly concludes that something more sinister is going on since 3 cops lost their lives in quick succession, all before their meeting with Internal Affairs. Pretending to take the footage to the forensics lab then, Marty gets rid of it before heading over to an abandoned barn where he has been holding a dealer named Bones hostage for the past 3 days. Knocking him out, Marty then collects his DNA to blame him for all the cop killings before putting him in his car's trunk and driving away. Elsewhere, Dan goes over to meet Jimmy's wife, Sonia Rogan, who initially is wary of even letting him in. Only after confirming that he is really the detective assigned to the case does she invite him into her home. She then tells him that since Jimmy worked in the narcotics department, he had plenty of enemies, but that nothing out of the ordinary had happened recently. Realizing that she was certainly keeping something from him, Dan urges her to tell him everything she knows. However, fearing for her life, she refuses to say anything more. Driving to the harbor to end Bones' life, meanwhile, Marty doesn't anticipate Bones gaining consciousness and escaping instead. Meeting Dan over a drink later, he tells him not to worry about Sonia keeping things from them too much, since it is quite obvious that she is uncertain of the police, as not only has her husband passed along with his cop partner, but Internal Affairs has been looking into them as well. Agreeing with Marty's view, Dan then asks him if the forensics lab was able to help with the quality of the doc's footage. Marty simply lies and says that there wasn't anything they were able to do. Floating the possibility of the culprit being a cop himself, Dan is shut down by Marty just as he receives an urgent call from the forensics department. Promptly heading over, they learn about evidence tying Trevon Bones Richardson to the crime scene. A SWAT team accompanied by Marty and Dan then descends at Bones' hideout. While the team and Dan meticulously look through the place, Marty discreetly plants evidence with Bones' fingerprints. When Bones is seen trying to escape, on the other hand, Dan follows him out and chases him through the streets. Eventually, getting to the station, Bones boards a train and takes a passenger hostage. Urging Bones to let go of the hostage, Dan mentions the 3 cop killings he is already responsible for. Denying his involvement with the crimes, Bones insists that he was kidnapped and held in a place that smelt like garlic. Enraged as he is about being blamed for things he had nothing to do with, Bones attacks Dan, who promptly shoots him. The case having been deemed as solved, Dan meets Sonia one day when she collects Jimmy's things from work. While she thanks him for his efforts, Marty, joining the conversation, puts her off and she takes her leave. At a family dinner later that evening, Dan asks if Marty has an issue with Sonia based on her cold treatment earlier. Reluctant to say anything at first, Marty eventually mentions having competed with Jimmy for a promotion in the past. He says that since he got the promotion, things turned somewhat sour between him and Jimmy. Speaking to Casey later, Dan coincidentally learns about him not skating anymore in the place that reeks of garlic. Reminded of Bones mentioning being held in a similarly stinking place, Dan seeks a meeting with Sonia again the next day. More willing to talk to him this time, she quickly clarifies that the promotion isn't the reason she dislikes Marty. Instead, she mentions that his behavior changed after the White Alliance was taken down. She explains that an undercover cop group consisting of Marty, Sal, Jimmy, and Tyrone was assigned to dismantle the biker gang that worked as a dealer in the city. She recalls Jimmy mentioning that from around that undercover assignment, Marty has been displaying an attitude in an attempt to distinguish himself from the others. While she assumed that Bones was working for the Alliance, Dan realizes that the case is far from being done, since the killer was specifically targeting the cops who brought the Alliance down. Meeting the gang's leader in prison then, Dan learns that the gang lost money worth $2 million to Marty and his group of undercover cops. Armed with this information, Dan meets Sergeant Clark, only to find that he has already closed the case against Sal, Tyrone, and Jimmy. Looking through the file, he soon realizes that the case was never about the White Alliance bust, since the sergeant also does not seem to know about it. Confirming that Marty wasn't able to see the file, Dan decides to look further into him. Working late that night, he finds a lawsuit against an insurance company, and is reminded of the conversation they had during the first time the families got together. Promptly contacting the hospital in Oaxaca, Mexico, he pretends to be Marty to obtain a copy of the receipt of Beth's time there. Upon confirming Beth's date of birth, he is told that there isn't any outstanding balance on the bill. He also learns that the last remaining amount was paid in lump sum, not by credit card, but instead in cash. Just as he hears that Marty paid a bill of over $212,000 in cash, Dan is startled by the arrival of an angry Marty. Accused of not taking Marty's calls, Dan makes up an excuse of having to visit the doctor with Layla. While Dan is visibly shaken about the possibility of Marty being the killer he has been looking for, Marty assumes that he is disturbed by Bones' end, as it was the first time Dan ended a life. Assuring Dan of having done the right thing, Marty then asks him to go home and get some rest. Taking him up on the suggestion, Dan insists on being fine before driving away after Marty. Soon later, Marty gets back and checks Dan's desk to look into what he was working on. Unable to get into his computer without the right password, in addition to not finding anything in the trash either, Marty decides to leave. Suddenly remembering that Dan was on the phone when he got there earlier, he turns back and calls the last dialed number. Realizing that Dan was speaking to the hospital in Oaxaca, Marty understands that he has been caught. Driving through narrow roads, Dan meanwhile arrives at the barn that smells like garlic. Carefully looking around the place doesn't yield much until he suddenly hears a sound. Cautiously investigating to see if someone followed him there, he soon finds that it is just an open door outside the barn that is swaying in the night's breeze. Relieved, he returns to the barn and comes across a stray piece of torn fabric snagged at the entrance. Determined to investigate further, Dan takes the piece of fabric to the forensics lab and is assured that it will soon be compared to Bones' jacket available among the evidence of the case. His suspicions are further confirmed when he learns that Marty never brought in the security footage as he said he would. Rushing home then, he finds Marty there. On his way out, Marty ominously warns Dan to leave the case alone and focus on his family instead. Recognizing the threat for what it is, Dan then gets Marty to confess to having taken money from a criminal. Marty tries justifying his deed by saying that he did this just once, and that too, for Beth's cancer surgery. Differentiating himself from the others, he says that while he stole money just once, greedy cops like Sal, Tyrone, and Jimmy continued to repeatedly extort multiple establishments. Riddled with confusion, Dan speaks to Layla later that night and wonders what his next step should be, only for her to simply ask him to do the right thing for their safety. Elsewhere, Marty thinks of a way out of the mess when his superior calls him with information about having to meet Sergeant Clark with Dan the next day. In the morning, Dan receives a call from the forensics lab confirming the match of the fabric he found to Bones' jacket. While he is told that since the jacket is a rare vintage item, it can reasonably be concluded that the fabric is a perfect match. Layla prepares to take Dan's car to visit the doctor. Making up his mind, Dan decides to keep this a secret just as he hears Layla exit the house. Trying to catch her attention through the window, he sees her getting into his car just as it suddenly goes up in flames. Grieving the loss of his wife and unborn child, he then determinedly rushes over to confront Marty. Using the back door to get into his house, an armed Dan cautiously looks around the seemingly empty space. Convinced that the house is empty after confirming that there isn't anyone in the bedroom upstairs, Dan makes his way back down. That is when Marty ambushes him and forces him out. Held at gunpoint later that evening, Dan stops driving and threatens Beth's life if he survives Marty's wrath. Realizing Dan's intention when he suddenly begins driving rashly, Marty jumps out of the car just before Dan drives it off a ledge. While the car explodes, Marty looks around the area for Dan even as he stumbles across hurriedly to hide. Eventually, Dan distracts Marty to attack and subdue him. At Dan's mercy now, Marty profusely apologizes for having caused Layla's end since he was the one who placed an explosive in Dan's car. Continuing to apologize even as they hear the sound of the approaching police, Marty accepts Dan being a better cop than him and urges him not to throw his life away. About to relent, Dan takes Marty by surprise one last time before choosing to shoot him anyway.